Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 71. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We're so glad that you joined us. In our study of the background of the Bible, we've seen that Genesis 1 is an account of creation, but it's a radical departure from the conventional beliefs at the time. In Genesis 1, verses 1 through 2, we see that God alone pre-exists creation, and that He, not the gods, created everything. In chapter 1, verses 3 through 25, we see that contrary to belief or common belief at the time, there are no gods running the universe. And last week we saw in Genesis 1, 26 through 31 that humanity is the crown of creation being made in the image of God. Tonight we continue looking at Genesis 1, 26 through verse 31 by addressing the question, what does the Bible mean when it says God created humanity in His image and according to His likeness? To answer this question, we have to first understand the way that the Hebrew of the Bible was written. It was written in what's called the recursive or repetitive style. This is often called parallelism. They would write something and then rewrite something else, repeating what they'd already said, but just a little bit differently. It's kind of like the Dolby sound system. The same music comes out of both speakers, but one speaker's music is just a little different than the other. And this difference in the two speakers adds richness and fullness to the sound. That's what the Hebrew way of writing, the recursive writing style, did for Hebrew. It was kind of like a Dolby sound system. It had fullness as well as clarity and beauty to what was being written. This happens on a large scale in Genesis chapters 1 through 2, where in chapter 1 of Genesis, it records the story of creation on a macro level or a large level, while chapter 2 records creation on a micro level. Chapter 1 of Genesis is simply written from the perspective of a wide-angle lens, and while Genesis chapter 2 is written from a narrow-angle lens. Both are talking about the same creation event, but from a different perspective. And by bringing them together, you kind of get a bit fuller view of what really was going on. But this recursive or repetitive style of writing not only took place on a macro level, it also took place on a micro level or a small level. We see this in things like the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 15:1, which is one of my favorite proverbs, says this, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Now there are two clauses in this proverb. A clause is like a miniature sentence. It's like usually part of a sentence, but it could stand as a sentence on its own. But often you'd have clauses and phrases together. But this two clauses are found in Proverbs 15:1. And Solomon puts these two clauses together in one sentence. But both clauses say the same thing, just in a different way. First, a soft response to someone calms them down. That's what he means by a soft answer turns away wrath. He's saying a soft response calms people down. But then he says just the opposite, and it's also true. A harsh response ticks people off. If you don't believe me, just try it. When you're out in traffic, when you give a harsh response to somebody cutting you off in traffic, they usually let you know that they're not happy, and we'll just leave it there because a harsh word stirs up contention. But it's only when you put these two clauses together do you really get a full understanding of what this proverb actually means, which is simply this. It's better to respond to people softly than harshly. That putting these two thoughts together is what they call a hen diades. A couple of examples of this in English are nice and warm, by and large, here and now, and then and there. It's really one thought, like, nice and warm just means it's a nice day. By and large means this is the way it is. Here and now means simply at the present, and then and there means over there or in the future. The word for image is the Hebrew word salem. It means image or idol, model, or a copy, or something that resembles something. The word likeness is the Hebrew word demuth. It means something similar, something resembling, or something like. Now on the surface, it looks like that Moses is just repeating himself, but he really isn't. These two words, image and likeness, both have different nuances that when you put them together gives us the full picture of what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God. Now this is best illustrated by an inscription that is found on the Tel Fakhariya inscription located in modern Syria. Archaeologists found a statue there of a king with an inscription written on it, both in Akkadian, which is an ancient Semitic language, and Aramaic, which is another ancient Semitic language. But Aramaic is like a cousin language to biblical Hebrew. In fact, the Bible has, in certain places, some portions of the Bible is actually written in Aramaic. There's only a small section that's found in Daniel, but that is in there nonetheless. And so the languages were very similar. Now, the Aramaic word used for image is used twice in this inscription, and both times it refers to how the image was a copy of an original, but with the nuance of the copy represented the original to the world. So it speaks of representation. The Aramaic equivalent for likeness is also used twice in the inscription, and both times it refers to the relation of the copy to the original. So this speaks of relationship. And so when we put these two words together, we learn that Genesis 1:26 is saying this: Adam and Eve were created in the image of God, meaning they were made to look like God. They resembled God in some fashion or form, which we'll talk about in another Digging Deeper moment. But they were made to resemble God so that they could represent Him to creation. In other words, Adam and Eve were God's representatives on the earth. And so when it speaks of image, that's what it's speaking of. That they don't just resemble God in what they look like, they resemble God in the sense that they represent Him to creation. That's why G.K. Chesterton, the famous writer, used to say that when the animals in the garden saw Adam and Eve, they would look and say, oh, there goes God walking in the garden, because Adam and Eve represented God to creation. But Adam and Eve were also made in the likeness of God, which means they were made to resemble God so that they could relate to Him in a way that the rest of creation could not. In fact, this is the idea of the word holy in the Bible. The word holy in the Bible doesn't really mean perfect. It means different or unique. Mankind is made in the Genesis account holy in the sense that he is unique or different from all the rest of creation. And the way mankind is made, the way humanity is made, is in a way that they resemble God in some form or fashion, which we'll look at next week in a little bit more detail, so that they could relate to Him and represent Him. So in other words, as we saw last week, 10 times prior to Genesis 1:26, everything that had been made in creation was made according to its kind. Like a tree was made according to its kind, a flower made according to its kind. 10 times it says that in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 25. But here we see that Adam and Eve were created according to God. Why? So that they could relate to God in a unique way. So that mankind could relate to God in a way that no one else in creation could. And so that they could represent Him in the earth. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 72. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We're really glad that you joined us. We now need to tackle two other statements found in Genesis 1:26. The first is, let us make, and the second is, let them have. Let's read this together. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Many modern versions of the Bible fail to fully convey what the Hebrew text is actually saying here. And this is important because an important point is at stake. The way that verse 26 is written in Hebrew, with the phrase, let us make, followed by the phrase, let them have, it is very clear in Hebrew that this marks purpose or result. Hebrew grammarians are in agreement about this. And so what this verse means in the Hebrew is this: let us make man in our image and likeness so that they may rule. Most translations don't put that "so that" in there, but it would be proper to do so. The purpose for which we were created in the image and likeness of God was so that we could relate to God and so that we could relate to the earth on God's behalf. This is why the rest of Genesis 1:26 says, let them have dominion, rulership, over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over everything that creeps upon the face of the earth. You and I were made to relate to God so that we could rule for God. I think that's pretty cool, don't you think? You're a ruler, you're a king, you're a queen. That's why God made us. But wait, there's more. Verse 27 goes on to repeat, there's that Hebrew style of writing, that humans were made in God's image. But by now, anytime we see repetition, we should begin expecting to learn something new because this repetition is adding some important details. And the details that are given here are about our being created in God's image. Let's read it, verse 27. It says, "So God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Now, there are three things stated here, and the way these are written in Hebrew also tells us some interesting things. The first statement that says, "So God created man in his own image," this is written pretty much like a normal Hebrew sentence. So there's nothing really different about that. But the other two statements, "In the image of God he created him, and male and female he created them," they're not written like a normal Hebrew sentence. Now, we don't see that in the English, but when you study this in the Hebrew, it does. It becomes very apparent. The way these are written makes it clear that these two statements are a parenthesis or a footnote. In other words, they're added detail. They're added details about what it means to be created in God's image. In other words, when it says in verse 27, "So God created man in his own image," now he's giving you added detail about what it means to be created in God's image. So he's adding new information. This is very important because this verse 27, is often taken to mean that the image of God is reflected in humanity's maleness and femaleness. But this is not what it's saying at all. We know this because verse 28 says, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" When we look at verse 27, in relationship with verse 28, guess what we see? We see more repetition. And by now, when we see repetition, we should know that we're going to get added detail. This time, the repetition is seen in how these two verses are structured together. Now, this may seem like a little bit complicated for this kind of a lesson. Just hang on for a moment. But the way these two verses are arranged is in classic Hebrew style, something called a chiasmus. A chiasmus is like an hourglass. The top and the bottom mirror each other. They repeat each other. So an outline form would be AB, BA, 1, 2, 2, 1. This is very common throughout the Old Testament, and it's very common in Hebrew. Now watch how these two verses mirror each other when we outline them. Verse 27 says, "So God created mankind in his image. A, in the image of God he created them. B, male and female he created them." Verse 28, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply,'" that's B, letter A, "subdue it and rule over it." So the first letter A correlates to the second letter A. In other words, letter A is talking about letter A, and the first letter B refers to the second letter B. So they're talking about the same things, just adding different details. So the first letter A, "made in the image of God," is connected to man's rulership, which is the second A. The first B, male and female, is connected to the second B, "be fruitful and multiply." Hear what I'm saying, because I'm saying all this to say this. What this means is that the divine image in humanity is not reflected in maleness and femaleness. Divine image is reflected in humanity's relationship and rulership. And this is very important, particularly today in some of the discussions that we have in our culture. Being male and female is not the basis for the being made in the image of, in likeness of God. It's the basis for the blessing of fruitfulness and multiplication. Male and female gender is how humans multiply and fill the earth and are blessed. And that word blessed means to be increased. This seems to be like splitting hairs. You say, "Pastor Bob, you're splitting hairs." It's not. This is quite significant, and it has tremendous bearing on our identity as human beings. Because it means that each man and each woman bears the image of God apart from the other. God made male and female in the image of God. He didn't just make man, Adam, in the image of God. And we don't have to be married, because if you put these together and say male and femaleness reflect the divine image, then we have to be married to bear the image of God. But that's not what the Hebrew is saying. It's saying every man and every woman individually, whether married or not, bears the image of God. This is highly significant because it removes sexuality as the means by which humanity bears the image of God. And it makes sexuality in human beings about procreation. There's other things that the text will say later in this story, but for now we're staying on this particular point. And by doing this, it's creating a separation, hear me, between religion and sexuality. This is something the ancient world could never do. It never did. Summarizing all this, we see that the Genesis 1 creation account gives us the 3 R's of the creation of humanity thus far. Number 1, relationship. We are created to relate to God. Number 2, rulership. We were created, male and female, in the image and likeness of God, to be rulers, to represent God on the earth. And thirdly, we were created male and female so that we could fulfill the blessing that was put upon us of reproduction to multiply and fill the earth. If this lesson helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I hope to see you next week.